Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. Today I begin my two-part ranking of all 19 Albert Campion novels written by Margery Allingham, with this video containing the bottom 9 titles. I received a lot of requests to cover Albert Campion, and I listened. And I will say, I was never the biggest fan of Albert Campion. I did not include him on my top 10 literary detectives list. I just never connected with these books, largely because they're not traditional murder mysteries for the most part. But I will say, this is my third time reading these stories, and I had a much better experience this time around. My opinion of Campion rose to the point where I think I regret not including him on my top 10 detectives, and my opinion of Marjorie Allingham went up as well. I always considered her to be my least favorite queen of crime, with the order clearly being Christie 1, Marsh 2, Sayers 3, Allingham 4, with sizable gaps in between them. But now I think the gap between Sayers and Allingham is much closer than it ever was. I think Allingham is a better writer than Sayers. I think she's easier to read and more entertaining. Now, in terms of crafting a mystery, I think Sayers still has the edge. Although, truth be told, I probably would rather read like Allingham over Sayers, even though I enjoy Sayers' mystery plots much more. But before I begin this ranking, make sure you like and subscribe to keep up to date with the channel. And as always, there may be spoilers ahead, but I will warn you when one is coming, and you can use the chapter titles to skip around if need be. Number 19, the only Albert Campion novel I think is just outright bad, and I suspect this might actually be an unpopular opinion, but here I have Mystery Mile, the second Campion novel, and really the first to star Campion. And I'll start by saying I think this book has a lot going for it. I mean, this is the book that establishes much of the Campion universe. We meet Lug for the first time, and I've always loved Lug. He did make my top 10 literary detective sidekicks, and this is the book where we learn a little more about Campion, like such as like not his, that not being his real name, and that made me a member of the British royal family. When I think of Campion and Lug and what I know about them, most of that information comes from this book. So this is a very important book. However, I just simply don't like it. I mean, this is an adventure thriller, which I would say I think Allingham does thrillers better than the other three queens of crime, who all dabble in this from time to time, and it just works better with Campion, but still, it's a thriller and not a particularly interesting one at that. We have a disappearing American judge, and I just find the plot of this book to be very whiplashly, with things just constantly piled up on top of another, and then we're here and then we're there. It feels very much like a Franken plot. Like there's a lot of different plot points going on, and they don't really come together well. And on top of that, this book just doesn't hold my attention. I suspect this book is actually well regarded by fans of Allingham based on my research into her works, but I don't particularly care for it at all, so it comes in at last place here at number 19. Number 18 is the beginning of a streak of late career Campion novels. The last 5 books are all in a row here, and the worst of these, in my opinion, is The Beckoning Lady, also called The Estate of the Beckoning Lady. Now, I think The Beckoning Lady, like Mystery Mile, has some things going for it, and it does things better than the titles above it do. But I mean, The Beckoning Lady just exemplifies all of the issues I have with late career Campion. The positive is that this book actually does feature Campion and crew fairly regularly. We have a lot of Campion, a lot of Lug, a lot of Campion's wife Amanda, and this is really the only book where their son Rupert gets a lot of page time. These characters are used very sparingly in like the last few books. I like the depiction of post-war England in this book. You know, if you've listened to my previous videos, you know I just love books set in like the aftermath of World War II. And there's a lot of talk about like taxes, with Margery Allingham having very large tax bills later in life, much like Agatha Christie. And they both love to bring up taxes and criticize the tax system in their works, especially during like the 1950s. The writing and the plot of this book are rough, however, and these are just some of the major issues I have with late career Campion. There are a lot of characters in this book, many of whom get mentioned a lot, but we never meet them until like well past the halfway point, if we meet them at all. we get almost no like real introduction to many of them, and it makes it very confusing to keep track of who is who. The setup of this book is just a bunch of people talking about this like big party, and you think this party is going to be this like important scene in the book, but it just like constantly drags on, and the party never happens until like the very end of the book. I found the plot very meandering, and this is a traditional murder mystery, but it's not really given that much thought in the book, to be honest, and Campion just kind of solves it without any real clues or a way for the reader to get there. Campion comes off as really unlikable in this book as well. He's extremely misogynistic towards the wonderfully named Prunella Scrupdori, who is a character who's, barely in this book and later becomes Charles Luke's wife, with Charles Luke being one of the most boring recurring characters in any mystery series. It's a shame Allingham seemed to prefer him in these later books, but Prunella is constantly bashed on for no reason, despite her barely even appearing and having no real purpose in the story. It's extremely strange. And The Beckoning Lady, I mean, it does have some minor positives, but it's mostly a slog and heavily flawed, so it comes in at number 18. At number 17, a similar situation with this book, but a little better, and that is The China Governess. The plot here is a little stronger. It's not really a traditional murder mystery, but focuses primarily on Tim Kinnett, who is a young man who wants to marry his girlfriend Julia, but there is some unusual stuff in his background that's preventing the marriage from happening. This book feels like one of like the better Miss Silver novels. I mean, Campion is barely in this one, and like The Beckoning Lady, the plot of the book is just all over the place. Tim was adopted, and this book has a lot of weird commentary on adoptions and inheriting criminal tendencies, which are subjects best avoided in these books. And it comes across as just really weird and uncomfortable. The basic plot is simple to follow, but it goes off the rails at multiple points. And then we get these sporadic mentions of major violent crimes Timothy may or may not have committed, and they just come totally out of nowhere. And the characters talk about them as if the reader knows everything about them when we've barely been introduced to them. I find this very typical of late career Campion, which I find characterized as just like random things constantly popping in without explanation. Now, I find this story to be more interesting and less frustrating than The Beckoning Lady, but like I said, Campion is barely in this one. It's mostly Charles Luke again, and we get another really weird reference to Luke's wife Prunella and how awful she is. At the beginning of this book, we learn that Prunella died in childbirth with a really nasty commentary that she went into labor and didn't ask for assistance because she was stubborn, so she just died. And it's really bizarre. I'll admit, I'm not too knowledgeable in like the behind the scenes stuff, so to speak, regarding Margery Allingham, but I suspect Prunella might be based on someone she knew and hated. But the plot of the China Governess lacks cohesion, intrigue, and Campion, so it comes in at number 17. At number 16, I have the final Albert Campion novel, Cargo of Eagles. And Margery Allingham died before she could complete this novel, so her husband Phillip Youngman Carter finished it while using her notes. And normally I don't include novels not 100% written by the original author, but I felt like Cargo of Eagles was close enough. I mean, you can definitely tell which parts are written by Allingham and which by her husband. The book ends with a summation gathering that Campion never gives in any other book. Now, I will say I wish Youngman Carter blended his style with his wife's better, but it's not as if like he does a completely poor job of it. I do think it needed to be better, however, and I enjoyed the pirate theme of this book. It's thriller plot mostly, and that's fine. It's not like spectacular, but we have no Charles Luke, when quite a heavy presence of Lug, whose page time had unfortunately been dwindling in these last few books. And for me, this book comes across as a bit heavy handed in the depictions of 1960s youth culture, with it being mostly what you would expect from a somewhat conservative older author of the time. A lot of depicting youths as delinquents and all that. The plot goes considerably off the rails toward the end of the book, and while this book does contain more Campion than later books, I did feel there was like something off about him here. It didn't quite feel like Campion, and I think it could be just because there's a different author here. And Campion is the very rare detective who aged mostly in real time, and I think that issue with that seems particularly on display here. And I didn't find Albert Campion as his usual character, but the plot is mostly fine, so I have Cargo of Eagles here at number 16. At number 15, another book that goes off the rails quite a bit at the end, and that is Hide My Eyes, also called Tether's End or 10 Were Missing. And I'm going to be honest, I don't understand any of those three titles. They don't really fit the book for me. This is another book with very little Campion and very little mystery. It's mostly thriller with a fairly obvious culprit. There are murders, but those are not like the big mysteries here. There is another book where past crimes are constantly brought up as if the reader is supposed to be familiar with them, but we're just simply not. Although it's not as egregious in Hide My Eyes as it is in other books. I do find this book entertaining and intriguing. I wish I could place it a little higher up on the list, but I can't because it has those same flaws as the other books in this tier, and it feels appropriate to place it with those other books. I suppose these books' heroes are another young couple in love, Annabelle and Richard, with Annabelle on the precipice of inheriting a distant relative's estate just out of the blue. This feels like another like Miss Silver-esque novel, although quite frankly, it's a much better one with more nuance and much better characters. I enjoyed this story quite a bit, but it did leave me frustrated at times, and I can't place this one too high, so Hide My Eyes comes in at number 15. At number 14, I have the final Lake Campion novel in this tier, and that is The Mind Readers. This is another book I enjoyed but find heavily flawed. The main piece of intrigue for me is the inclusion of these alleged mind reading devices used in the book by Campion and Amanda's nephews. This book is set in 1965, and there are a number of Cold War references with a number of characters working on some kind of secret project related to intelligence and wartime efforts. Some of these talk about mind reading and these devices is a little weird and strange. I mean, my advice to authors would be to like avoid writing entire books surrounding a subject you know like very little about. And Allingham doesn't come across as particularly knowledgeable here. It's like she like read something about this in the newspaper and was like, "Oh, I'm going to make a whole plot out of it." When it just felt weird to me. But I think it's a pretty strong mystery. The nephews are almost kidnapped and then they eventually are kidnapped. And this is a pretty solid thriller. It's entertaining throughout and keeps my attention. Now, it's not extraordinarily good, and I don't think it does anything like particularly special. So I felt like I couldn't place it much higher. So I have The Mind Readers here at number 14. Number 13 is a book I almost didn't include on the list, and that is The Case of the Late Pig. And the reason why I almost left this off is because this book is borderline a novella. It is the shortest Campion novel and is unique in many ways. My edition of the Campion books includes this one as a novel, so I included it here. But from what I understand, other editions treat The Case of the Late Pig as a novella. I think it's long enough to be a novel. But this book is narrated by Albert Campion, the only novel or short story, I believe, even written as such, and a very rare case of a golden age mystery narrated by the main sleuth, which is a practice that's very common today. Campion attends the funeral of his old friend slash enemy slash acquaintance whom he hated, Pig Peter, only to find out months later that Pig Peters apparently has died again. And I love this quandary. This is such an interesting mystery here. We have a dead body that apparently died twice, and Campion has to figure out what is going on. For such a short book, Allingham is able to depict wonderful characters. These characters are very well developed and depicted much more so than the characters in like The Beckoning Lady, which is a much longer novel and had more opportunity to be developed. I think the mystery itself is good. It's not brilliant, but still very strong. It's a murder mystery with heavy thriller like elements. I wish I could put The Case of the Late Pig higher, as I enjoy it more than like the next few titles, but I felt the other titles have just more going for them and probably deserve the benefit since this book is something of an outlier. It feels a bit different than the typical Albert Campion novel, although I enjoy what it does. I have The Case of the Late Pig here at number 13. At number 12 is a traditional mystery novel, though one I have quite a few issues with, and that is Flowers for the Judge. I suspect this low ish ranking for this book may also not be the general consensus. I enjoyed the premise of this book. We have two members of a publishing family vanishing into thin air 20 years apart. The first cousin who disappeared remains missing, but the second one turns up dead in a vault from carbon monoxide inhalation. The mystery here is very good. I enjoy some of the obfuscation in this one where another cousin actually entered the vault where the body was and just like apparently didn't notice it was right there, even though he should have, and that throws a lot of suspicion on him. This is the first book on this list where I feel like Campion is really at the top of his game investigation wise. He's extremely active in the way I think we expect him to be. The problem with this book for me is that I find it drags considerably. I feel as if the beginning of this novel is just full of nothing. Like nothing is going on here. I don't find any intrigue in the first 100 pages or so, with a lot of characters just talking. I think the second half of the book is very strong, but the issue for me is that the first half of any novel is the more important half because if I'm not interested in that part, I'm not going to be interested in the second half, no matter how good it is. I'm just simply not invested. If I don't care about the characters, then I'm not invested in their outcomes. And we have a bit of the ending going off the rails in a spectacular and highly unrealistic fashion. And a mild spoiler here for another Campion novel called Death of a Ghost. But the twist in this book is essentially the same twist in that book, which is the book immediately before this one chronologically, which for me is a bit of a letdown. I think there are strong aspects to Flowers for the Judge, but I have issues with it, so it comes in at number 12. At number 11, the final novel for this video is the very first Albert Campion novel, The Crime at Black Dudley, also called The Black Dudley Murder. And beginning with this book, I think we're in the novels I would consider good. I've always enjoyed The Crime at Black Dudley, which is of the parlor game mystery trope variety, and that was very common in the 1920s and almost always delivered. Albert Campion is not the main character here, although he is in the book like much more often than he is even in those like later career ones. George Abershaw, a Scotland Yard pathologist, is the main character and was supposed to be Allingham's main sleuth. She never intended Campion to be the star, but her publishers and editors just found him so much more interesting than Abershaw, and, quite frankly, so do I. This book alludes to Campion's unusual past and secrets that are more elaborated on in Mystery Mile. The murder here is a fun one that combines the traditional murder mystery with some professional criminal elements. I think this book does both of those things well, although I would simply prefer the lack of the professional criminal elements. But the murder in Black Dudley is very good mechanics wise. It all works. I do feel, especially when compared to like most of the books I've already talked about, and a few yet to be mentioned, this book is restrained. It doesn't get ridiculous, even towards like the end where many Campion books tend to go off the rail. I would place this book higher if Campion had been more of the star. I mean, to me, he is the main star, but that's not how Allingham wrote this book. So it's a bit of a knock. But this book is a lot of fun, although there's some like small critiques I have of it that really prevent me from placing it higher. It is a thoroughly enjoyable novel that I think fits perfectly in the middle of the list here at number 11. And that is it for this video. Next week, I finished off the ranking of every Albert Campion novel with my top 10 selections. Remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel to keep up to date. Until next time, Mystery Files.